Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to resilience, business continuity management, supply chain management, crisis management, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Today, we're going to be talking about building team resilience. And it's really interesting because today's guest reached out to me to be on the show. See, I've always told you, if you want to be a guest, just reach out. And today, I'm lucky enough somebody did that. And I'll tell you in a minute how that happened. But I want to welcome to the show team building expert, entrepreneur, organizational psychologist, and author, Kathryn McEwen. Kathryn, welcome to the show.
Oh, Alex, it's so lovely to be here in conversation with you. Thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you for reaching out. And as I mentioned, it was really interesting how you reached out. You were listening to one of the previous episodes with Tammy Horton, who happened to mention your work.
Yeah, so it was sort of, I was listening, it was almost like being channeled, and I thought, oh my goodness. And Tammy did a wonderful job, and I just thought I might be able to build on that, actually, Alex.
Well, I'm glad you reached out because I thought this would be a great topic for everybody. There's so much talk about resilience right now, whether it be personal, team, organizational, community. Resilience. There's just a lot of talk about it right now. So I'm really glad you reached out about that. Before we jump into any topic, could you take a minute or so and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my journey, if you like, into resilience at work around 15 years ago, I think it is now, Alex. And it was really in relation to my clients asking me for resilience. So this word was emerging. It was sort of the start of what we eventually call the VUCA. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. And I'm an organizational psychologist, so we like to measure everything. So right from the beginning, I was interested in, well, what actually is this concept called resilience when we apply it to work? How do we measure it? Because we need to be able to measure it before we can build it. And that started me on a 15-year episode, as I mentioned, around measuring. So I started off looking at measuring individual resilience. What does it look like to be an employee who's resilient? And then teams and leadership. Because for me, the systemic approach is really important. It's all about alignment. And what was a sort of a side curiosity, I suppose, became quite a large part of my work, because unexpectedly the measures were really resonating with academics. So they sort of created a large research base globally with all sorts of weird and wonderful applications of resilience in different occupations. And of course, the practitioners, they were really interested in the measurement, and then subsequently all the resources that we then use and the processes we use to build. And then more recently, in the last 2 years, in this emerging world where AI is going to be so dominant, I became really interested in how do we use technology to really scale this, and how cool would it be if every team in every organization had resilience in their DNA, and that we could collect some amazing data that could inform all our plans. So it's sort of it's been an evolution, and it's gone from what the Americans might call a side hustle to my main work, really. I think I still do other things like mediating and coaching, but this is definitely my main focus these days.
Well, I'm looking forward to chatting with you, especially when it comes to the measurement part, because I think that's really a big challenge for a lot of people. How do we manage measure resilience and measure many other things? So I'm looking forward to when we get to that part. But my first question for you, and I'm sure you probably know what it's going to be, is how do you define resilience?
Yes, definitions always contentious, and there's actually academic papers just debating it. And I'm a bit of a practical person, and so when people said, "What's resilience?" I listened to what they saw as an outcome, so I sort of looked at, they know what resilience looks like when they smell it, feel it, hear it. What is that? And then how does that then inform my definition? Because my work was always about measuring and developing. So you have the outcomes in mind. And so right from the beginning, I avoided some of the dilemmas about throwing away the word resilience and calling it anti-fragility or something else, because it didn't quite capture, the bounce back piece. So right from the beginning, my version was, it's a healthier relationship with the challenges we have. So it's managing the everyday pressures in a healthy way. So that's the sustainability piece, which is huge at the moment. How do we sustain our performance without burning out? But it's also adapting. So it's also adapting to setbacks. And that's the growth mindset at an individual level, but it's actually the continuous improvement and the agility to stay relevant at the team level. And then the last bit of the definition is proactively anticipating challenges. So that's about, having an eye on the horizon, having that external radar around what is it we need to be mindful of in terms of risks and opportunities. So there's that 3 levels of managing the everyday stuff in a healthy way, adapting and growing, and then proactively positioning. And so right from the beginning, 15 years ago, when I first developed a definition of individual resilience, that's what it was. And the only difference between the individual definition and the team definition is the word collectively managed. But that word collectively packs an enormous punch, because trying to get collective alignment is, as we'll talk about, is really interesting on a team, as we all know.
I got a quick question, because you mentioned anticipating, adverse situations and being able to always respond effectively, shall we say, to situations. Is it responding effectively to every situation? Because sometimes you can be really good, and a team can be really good in an organization, and then something really happens that can send everyone for a loop. Does that mean they all of a sudden they're resilient up to a point and then they're not resilient?
You're quite right, Alex. There's no way we can anticipate every challenge, but my work is looking at creating a DNA in the team, if you like, so that whatever happens, they have joint problem solving, they have connectedness across with other teams and with their stakeholders, they have a sense of optimism and positivity. They have all of those elements that we use in our measurement of resilience that create a DNA that, even if the challenges are not the ones they anticipated, which is probably 90% of the time at the moment, they actually have the capacity in their dynamics, in their processes, in their relationships, that it's not as big a deal as it might have been otherwise, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's look at the building resilient teams now, because you have some interesting components that make up. Can you explain all those different components that make up how you build resilient teams?
Yeah, sure. And it's important to note that this came out of the measure. So when I talk about these components, we developed a psychometric measure, with all the scientific rigor that you have to have around that. And the survey is 43 items, but there's these 7 components, which I'm actually going to speak about. So the measure and the model are one and the same thing, if you like. And just to backtrack, how we derived this assessment was looking at teams and seeing, and this is about 6-7 years ago now, seeing that teams were needing to actually do quite additional things to actually stay relevant and to be, I wouldn't say thriving, but managing their challenges. And we've had decades of research on what creates an effective team, but there were different things happening. And so this model and measure really are looking at basics of team effectiveness, but the emerging factors in this, what was called VUCA world, but now apparently is called Barney world, the brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible world. I learned that word the other day from a colleague. So these are them, and it's just a very brief summary. And even though I'm talking about them individually, they're all interrelated in some way. So we have to be quite a robust team. We have to have real clarity of our shared purpose and our goals, and we have to be very proactive in terms of managing our issues. And I like to think of this as that real sweet spot between disruption and making sure we don't lose the core important things to us. And, sometimes we can disrupt so much, particularly in the days of COVID. People were doing a lot of the old pivoting, and I think sometimes they lost their core values and purpose and had to return to those. Disruptors in the tech industry are a good example of that. Maybe, too much disruption, loss of values and ethics in that. We also have to be really resourceful. So if you think about one of the drivers of resilience in teams is too much to do with not enough staff, resources, money, etc. That imbalance that we know from our org psych literature, that that imbalance between demands and resources creates stress. So teams have to be really resourceful. They have to really prioritize, ruthlessly prioritize. They have to ruthlessly optimize their strengths and their resources and bring those to the table to meet those priorities. They have to be resourceful across teams rather than, silos and, this is my budget, not your budget, and so on. The next one's perseverance. Gosh, in the last 2 years, that's been huge. And you've got to remember all these were before COVID, right? So all of these just, nothing's changed. It's just become more important. So perseverance, so when things go wrong, what's happening in our team? If we are truly resilient on the perseverance component, we are regrouping, we're going into solution focus, we have a degree of hope and optimism, it's planning with optimism, planning with positivity, we're all in it. We're not looking to Alex as our leader to motivate us, there's a real sense of getting on with it.
Or finding one person to give you all the answers to everything.
Correct, yeah. And one of the evolving things in that area is the critical importance of collective leadership. We can't have one or two people, or whether it's the leader or anyone else, problem solving. The solutions are too complex. What got us to where we are is not what's going to get us to the next stage. So diversity and, so this is all around problem solving together, staying with hope. And then of course we have to do it healthily. So so it's all very well to do the sprint, as we know, but this is a marathon. So self-care is a really important piece, and it's, for me, in teams, it's the culture of self-care. So we focused probably too much on individual self-care in the last couple of years. But we can't do that if we don't have agreement across the team around boundaries and, what it looks like in terms of hours and work-life integration and providing breaks. And so those aligned and agreed boundaries and expectations of how we look after each other here is such a big part of the sustainable piece of the performance in a team.
It's kind of, I guess, Kathryns online at 7 a.m. Working, but that doesn't mean I have to be and everybody else should be. That kind of thing, right? Correct.
Yeah. Or we're all about self-care here, but we're going to have a 7 a.m. weekly meeting.
Yeah.
So, the overt versus the real way it works. The more we have collective conversations around how we look after each other, the more that gives me permission and not to feel guilty around not being online at 7 a.m. Of course, that's become huge in the past couple of years, but it was an issue way before, because I coach people every day around their personal self-care, but the plans disappear when the team has different versions of that so often.
I know I've experienced that, where there was a vice president said, yeah, 7 a.m., everyone should be available. But someone on the team was a single father.
Yes.
And he said, there's no way I can make a 7 a.m. He goes, at 7 a.m., I'm trying to get the kids up, dressed, have breakfast, and out the door. There's no way I'm going to attend. And the vice president, who was older and kids were in university, couldn't really understand that, that dynamic, that it was different.
Absolutely. And I think one of the good things around the last couple of years is people have become more mindful of what's happening in people's lives.
Yeah.
And have had to become more considerate because, of course, there's an expectation that flexibility and care are good leadership now. They're not just good leadership, they're probably non-negotiable if you want to retain staff, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just should I finish off the components of team resilience?
Yep,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah. The next one is what we call capability. So imagine a team where lots of things are changing around you, but you stay in the same roles and you stay in the same skill set and you stay internally focused. It's not long before you become irrelevant. So one of the really emerging factors for resilience in a team is very much to have a lot more of that external focus around what is happening with your customers, your stakeholders. What do they want of you now? How well are you doing that? Are you getting the feedback on that? Are you building your capability accordingly? Are you networked well? Are you networked with the people who can support you to do your job? So capability, in the same way as resourcefulness, have almost become a critical component of being able to deliver in a really changing environment. So lots of things shifting. We can't expect to be able to do the same things in the same way with the same skill set and without that external networking. And then we have closely associated with that is a sense of connected. So again, this has been a little bit fractured, but we're talking about teams here, but from the business continuity world that it's the connections across the system that matter, So how well are we connected within? So do we have the emotional glue that we feel cared and supported, but are we paying attention to the connections across the teams in our organization and to the teams outside of the organization, in our stakeholder groups, in our supply chain? I'm going to use different language for me. How well are we attending to that interconnectedness? So I do think that has a real connection to the business continuity. And the last one's actually alignment, and it's whether we're all actually have a shared version of success, whether we are aligned and optimistic, because the opposite of that is a team where people have their own agenda. So we can imagine an executive team where people don't have a shared version of success. They have a version of their success, their department's success, or there might not even be much optimism around success. So alignment is about we're all in this together. We're enthusiastic, we're optimistic. We can do what we can do, and our success is everyone's success. That's a lot of information in there, and there's lots of subcomponents in there, but they're the 7 components, if you like, that emerged out of our research into measuring this concept called team resilience.
You mentioned something. I wanted to jump in and ask the question, but it's the next item on our agenda anyway.
Yeah.
Organizational culture. How does that impact team resilience?
I'd like to do a switch on that, if I might, because I think that culture is developed by people, and the usual unit of work in an organization's teams. So I believe it's teams that have the capacity to transform culture. So I think that if we can invest in the team's DNA and the DNA that creates resilience, we will automatically have teams that are on purpose, they're on values, they are adapting, they are proactive, and that will then influence the culture. And if we're talking about a culture that makes the organization more resilient, then we can do tick, 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 tick on all those things. So I think culture, we sometimes talk about that being led from the top. And, I think we've all had experiences of the corporate values on the wall that bear no resemblance to what really happens. We still need that guiding principle, but we need to empower teams and get the collective knowledge and input of the team to create what we want the culture to be. And then we actually give them the power and the influence to enable that culture. Yeah, so they're one and the same thing, I think, because my belief from my practice anyway is if we're working with enough teams in alignment on these elements, that we will shift culture far better than top down or focusing just on individuals.
Is it all teams in the organizations practicing this and being this, or can it even start with just one team and then spreading that influence out?
Yeah, the team's very influential, absolutely. And I guess that's my interest in using technology at the moment to scale is we often, particularly in my network, a lot of people are coaches, and because of budgets and various things, it tends to be quite often only the top teams that get the support around building their resilience, and perhaps the rest of the organization gets some workshops. But what would it be if every team in the organization can be doing this? But the reality is quite often it's a couple, and we would hope that there's enough influence in those that it could spread out. But the more teams that are aligned and the more that are involved in this and the more you're able to scale it, the more quickly you're going to get that culture shift, I think. Particularly when it's quite entrenched and, in the business continuity and risk management world, a culture which is very risk averse, not very good at continuous improvement and adapting, stuck in old ways of working, clearly one or two teams, and that's not going to make any difference. You've got to create that sort of impetus, haven't you, of enough energy going in the right place. I think of it like a tipping point. You can almost see it sometimes in teams where suddenly that they've gone from in the wrong direction, and suddenly there's enough things happening that it goes in the right direction, and you can almost visceral, you can almost feel it. Yeah.
It sounds, maybe I'm thinking incorrectly, but it's not just a manager and her team, her direct reports, but it's also a team that's made up of managers as well. Like that's a team as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. So if you think about yourself in a role, say you're the director, you might be a member of the senior leadership team, and then you're a member of your function, and then within that function, your managers and your function are a leadership team across the management, and then you might be on a project team. So we're all in multiple teams. So the more we have that understanding in the way we operate, every time we move or in part of another team, we bring that DNA with us. And so the more we spread the love, if you like, the more it becomes the way the organization works. And that's what I've really been interested in using tech to scale, because previously it's very hard to scale good facilitation and working with each team individually. So I've got this, my vision is if every team across teams and teams of teams and management teams and leadership teams have the same language around what it means for us to be resilient, then we can shift cultures, and we can definitely create a culture where all the elements that we're wanting for organizational resilience are there. And more importantly, the plans are enabled versus being plans which sit there and then behaviors which sit here.
Mm-hmm.
A bit of a way off yet, but it's a work in progress. We've got the tech at the moment, so it's just, so work in progress.
On that note, I think that's the perfect spot to end our first segment today. We're talking with Kathryn McEwen, author, entrepreneur, and organizational psychologist, and we will be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. but leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.